Hello everyone, welcome to lectures 15 and 16, electronics in rap and hip hop. So this is going to be a bit of a longer lecture since it's two combined, so it's going to be divided up into 4 sections, so please make sure that you watch all of them. So to start off, we're going to talk about sort of the cultural and historical, political context in which rap and hip hop emerged in the 1970s. So a little bit of the context, a lot of you probably know that hip hop originated in the South Bronx in New York City. And so a little bit about New York City and the South Bronx in particular is that for decades, really since like the Great Depression and even before the Great Depression, New York City was a really booming industrial city. It had a ton of factory and manufacturing jobs. So it was a really great place to be if you were in the middle class. These jobs really catered to people that had, kind of a high school education or less. And it really, again, kind of led to a very strong middle class. In particular, it catered to a large immigrant population. This was especially at a time when lots of people were still immigrating to the United States. And these manufacturing jobs and factory jobs really catered to this middle class. And that really started to change really after World War II. So after World War II, there was kind of increased mechanization and the development of new communications technology, which really sort of decreased the number of these manufacturing and factory jobs that had really supported this middle class for decades. So really by the 1970s, there was this entire generation of young people in New York City that had kind of high school and trade school educations, but very little job prospects. And they basically had these educations for jobs that didn't exist anymore. And that was one element of this. And then on top of that, there was an affordable housing crisis that was the result of a lot of things, but a lot of it can really be traced back to this guy named Robert Moses, who's really like a very, like the evilest kind of scummy kind of guy that you can find. And Robert Moses had all of these urban renewal projects. And urban renewal, it sounds like, oh, investing in the city, right? But no, what the urban renewal projects were actually for was sort of coded language for the development of the suburbs and infrastructure to support basically white and wealthier people to move to the suburbs and then commute into the city. And this is a really kind of great example of a horrible thing that's happened in the United States throughout its history, which is this like state-sanctioned segregation. Basically ways in which kind of city planners and people used projects like urban renewal to create systems of segregation in the city. And so this infrastructure, again, really created, this project really created infrastructure so that people could commute from the suburbs into New York City. And this created like real bad systems of kind of inequality. And again, as I mentioned, sort of what this meant is that in general, white and wealthier people could move out of the city and to the suburbs, and people that didn't have as much flexibility or mobility couldn't. And well, I'll get into that in a little bit more. And this also really created the idea of the inner city. And again, this is something that was very much constructed by people. The inner city is really the sort of people that were left behind. They tended to be poorer. They tended to be people of color, in particular Black people, Afro-Caribbean and African immigrants and African Americans, as well as Latinx people. There was a huge Puerto Rican population in the Bronx at this time, and it kind of created slums in the South Bronx at this time. And this was really exacerbated by a particular freeway called the Cross Bronx Expressway. And this was this massive freeway that went right through the middle of the South Bronx. And this really destroyed entire neighborhoods. And so before the Cross Bronx Expressway was installed in the 1940s and 50s and through the 1960s, it was a really diverse, thriving kind of immigrant community. There were people of a lot of different backgrounds, immigrants from Italy, Puerto Rico, Germany, the Caribbean, etc. And there was a really thriving kind of immigrant ecosystem there. But this freeway really just like destroyed whole neighborhoods and destroyed the ways in which these communities connected and a lot of their livelihoods, their businesses, their homes, things like that. And some people were able to move, to relocate either within the city or to the suburbs, but a lot of people couldn't. And something that some of y'all might be aware of are things like redlining, where Black people especially, but also other people of color, weren't able to get loans and mortgages, or realtors wouldn't sell them houses in certain neighborhoods. So oftentimes, even people of color that could afford to move out of the Bronx couldn't, because of other kind of rules that were basically state-sanctioned segregation. And so what this affected hundreds and thousands of people, and it created this, again, this sort of segregated situation where many white people could move out of this neighborhood, but many Black people and other people of color could not move out of the South Bronx for reasons that didn't always include wealth or education or jobs or things like that. And again, this is really kind of an example of sort of like state-sanctioned segregation and systemic racism in the South Bronx. So you can imagine that if you were a young Black person or Puerto Rican kid or, immigrant in the Bronx in the 1970s growing up, you'd maybe just graduated from high school or just graduated from a combination high school trade school, it would be really depressing. You would feel like you didn't necessarily have a lot of options. There weren't a lot of jobs. A lot of the people around you, I mean, if you can see this picture here, lots of parts of the South Bronx in particular were just like under construction for decades at a time. And so you can imagine if like buildings were crumbling around you, you didn't have a lot of prospects, it would be really depressing. You would feel like you maybe didn't have a lot of voice or a lot of options. And so one thing, and this really gets back to Trisha Rose, most of this lecture is taken from Trisha Rose's work and other rap and hip hop scholars, that creative outlets that are sort of included in hip hop, which include rap, breakdancing, and graffiti, really gave young kids in the Bronx creative outlets so that they could express themselves. They had a sense of a voice through these different media to be able to kind of just, again, express themselves and be creative and be fulfilled as human beings. And yeah, so that's sort of the early kind of context of rap and hip hop. And I'm going to stop part one here, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about this, more of the sort of different elements of hip hop and the aesthetic influences in part two. All right, so in part one, we talked about some of the social and political context that hip hop emerged out of. And again, just to kind of reiterate, the South Bronx at this time was really just a sort of economically depressed. And again, there weren't a lot of job opportunities. There wasn't a lot of sense of like social mobility. So for young people that were growing up in the South Bronx, outlets that are sort of included in hip hop, including graffiti, breakdancing, and rap, provided really important outlets for self-expression and self-fulfillment and self-worth. And they, yeah, again, were really important for all of these things. And I really can't emphasize enough that hip hop at this time, again, included these three different practices: graffiti, breakdancing, and rap, and they were all sort of intertwined, and they all used similar aesthetics, and they were all influenced by similar aesthetics. And if you want to learn more about this, Trisha Rose talks about this in chapter 2 of her book, Black Noise, and I included that on Canvas if you're interested in reading more about it. So another thing, if you only learn one thing from this lecture on the development of rap and hip hop, it's that early rap and hip hop was intensely local. It happened in the South Bronx, and it relied on sort of networks in the neighborhood and cultural practices in the South Bronx, and it was intensely local. It was something that happened there and didn't happen anywhere else. So it emerged, and something else is that even within the South Bronx, each of the 5 sub-neighborhoods had their own sort of specific aesthetics associated with each of these practices, and each of the 5 sub-neighborhoods had their own crews that had, lead DJs, and their own sort of aesthetics. So it was local on like a real hyper local level. And hip-hop music in particular emerged out of music that was played at and made at block parties, basically. Block parties, which happened often outside in parks or in the street, and occasionally in the clubs, but it was traditionally kind of music that was made outside at block parties. And a block party, that sounds like maybe it's something that's like kind of informal, but these were really like well organized events that often were ticketed, and really well organized. People got paid, things like that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And so it's really part of this kind of cultural practice of pleasure and entertainment that on a Friday night, there might be a block party down the street and lots of people from the community would come. Everyone would dance, they'd drink, they have a good time. And this music really emerged out of that context. So even in the midst of all this economic depression and oppression, I think it's really important to emphasize that the music was really just a time of joy and a time of celebration and a time of, again, entertainment and pleasure. And again, celebrating and really engaging with Black cultural practices and with Black cultural priorities. Again, this was something that would happen in people's free time for enjoyment and entertainment. And at these parties, DJs tended to play the music that was popular at the time: disco, funk, R&B, and soul. And the DJs were really creative musically. And what started to happen is they noticed that when the break of a song happened, and a break in a pop song is when the voices drop out and it tends to be something like a drum solo or an instrumental solo that's really rhythmic, really catchy. It's kind of like a hook, a musical hook. And so what DJs started to do is they would isolate those breaks and then repeat them over and over and over again so that the voice didn't come back in. It was just this kind of rhythmic beats, basically. And then they started, on top of that, to isolate breaks from different songs and play them back to back. So on two different turntables, they'd have one break going on one turntable, another break going on another turntable, and they'd move back and forth between different breaks in different songs. And they created really sophisticated techniques to be able to do that. They would often create grooves in the records and things like that so that the break would repeat. And this practice of combining, making these strings of breaks that were repeated over and over again, were called break mixes. And so this is kind of where the DJ practice that is now kind of the music behind rap emerged. So these DJs isolated the break and then repeated those breaks and then made break mixes by just going from break to break to break to break. And these breaks were just taken from popular songs. So, disco songs, Chic's Good Time is a really famous one. Michael Jackson, when his Thriller record came out, the breaks from those songs were really popular. The music from James Brown was often used a lot. And at first, what's really important to note is that there was no rapping or MCing necessarily over these breaks. It was often just instrumental. And then what started to happen is that DJs, for instance, DJ Kool Herc is sort of most well known for doing this. He would kind of start chanting just a rhyme here or there over the break mix to sort of say like, yeah, move it like that or whatever, just like things that someone would say to basically just like encourage people to dancing, keep the energy up, things like that. And so eventually the kind of speaking and rhyming, rapping over these breaks emerged later, but the break mixes happened first. And so this gets into some of the technology that was used, and actually I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I want to take a step back a little bit, and I sort of already mentioned some of this, but I want to talk a bit about some of the different aesthetics and musical influences that went into the creation of early hip-hop music. And the three aesthetics that Trisha Rose talks about when she talks about hip-hop are flow, layering, and rupture in line. And I feel like we have a sense of this because rap music is so popular now, and these are still really important aesthetics in hip-hop and rap today. And flow, you can imagine that's creating this sense of like rhythmic flow of like continuous vocal lines or continuous beats that it's like it's never ending. Layering, which is often layering different rhythms, layering different voices, things like that. And then rupture in line. So if you're flowing, the rupture in line is kind of like that abrupt break and then like switch to a new rhythm that's like in a jolting but like pleasant sort of way. And so just think those are good things to keep in the back of your mind as you're listening to the tracks that we talk about in this class. So to get to the influences of rap and hip hop, it's really a combination of African American and Afro diasporic oral and musical traditions, plus the introduction of sort of newer technologies like the turntable, like large speaker systems, like mixers, and things like that. So the first and probably the most important musical tradition that goes into rap and hip hop is Jamaican dancehall and DJ culture. So in Jamaica, they have this really rich dancehall tradition where there would be these kind of parties that happen outside often with these massive speaker systems. And there's sort of multiple ways that the speaker systems happen. Sometimes they'd just be arranged on the ground like this. And then other times the speaker systems would be put in the back of trucks, and these trucks would just like go around from party to party and basically just show up with a DJ and their sound system, and they'd make music for these parties. And the music that tended to be played at these parties was real range. It was popular music, but then also later dub, which sort of stems out of reggae, and kind of making these dub mixes of kind of making like mixes on cassettes of clips of reggae music. And these, again, it was sort of in a similar context of early hip hop. It was for parties, music for parties. And one thing that I think is really great about these speaker systems in Jamaica is that they were called houses of joy, which is, I think, a really apt name. You know, these large speaker systems are the things that they would just pump out these rhythms so loud that it would move your body and create, again, this kind of euphoric sense of joy through music and dancing and things like that. In Jamaica, there was also these kind of, there was this tradition of doing toasting or boasting, of kind of chanting sort of prison-style rhymes over the dance music that was being played. And so the person that's kind of most noted from doing this, partly because they were a Jamaican immigrant, was DJ Kool Herc. He's sort of cited as the first person to not only make these break mixes, but then to sort of cite rhymes and start kind of rapping over the break mixes that were made. And so that's where we get here, boasting, toasting, signifying. And I think these are informal sort of Black, African-American, Afro-diasporic traditions that go back really to all the way to Africa, basically. It's something that enslaved people did in the United States, and then up through sort of Jim Crow era. It was kind of a consistent practice in the United States. And it's just basically a way of telling stories. And it's sort of, I think, another way to think about it is almost like spoken word, where it's sort of like a way to poetically and rhythmically tell a story in which there's rhymes, and you sort of like do a punchline and recite it in a rhythmic way. And I think someone who's probably most culturally known for sort of doing this in popular culture without necessarily having music is probably Muhammad Ali. Fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee, you know, the way in which he would sort of like trash talk his opponents and also talk about himself. I am the greatest. You know, that's a really good example of this kind of boasting or toasting practice that really dates back for a really long time in the US. Other musical influences just include popular music, things like disco, funk music, R&B, all of these things. And that's often where the samples from early hip hop and even hip hop today still come from. And so, yeah, that was a huge influence. And again, people like James Brown, Chic, Michael Jackson, Diana Ross, so whatever music was popular of the day tended to be incorporated in these early break mixes. And then, of course, as DJ culture got more sophisticated, then it became about finding that unknown record and including a break that no one's ever heard of. So it was kind of a mix of the two of combining popular music that people would be familiar with, but also with finding new breaks that people wouldn't necessarily know. It also comes from Black spiritual traditions and blues, in particular with things like call and response, repetition and variation. So again, with a break mix, that's a good example of that. If you're repeating a break over and over and over again, but then in subtle ways varying it throughout. And when you watch, there's a video of Grandmaster Flash doing some demonstrations of his DJ techniques on Canvas, that'll give you a better idea of what that means. And call and response, I think this is a good, maybe one way to think about it, even though it's kind of cheesy, is like if someone says, hey, ho, hey, ho. I'm so sorry that I just did that, but it's an example of the way in which call and response, which was kind of taken from gospel and more church tradition, spiritual traditions, in the US, that it would be incorporated also into hip hop. And then lastly, the last poets and civil rights orators were also big influences to hip hop and rap at this time. And this comes in particular with the ways in which social consciousness and sort of political messages, activist messages, were really a part of rap and hip hop from the earliest days, and we'll talk about that more later. And again, this is kind of the idea of like spoken word over like a rhythmic beat. And people that did this include people like Gil Scott-Heron and Amiri Baraka. And that also kind of has ties to the Nation of Islam and the 5% Nation, which is again sort of like Black Islamic practices in the United States that are also kind of linked to Black nationalism in the United States. So that's a bit of the aesthetic background. So now I want to talk just again a little bit about sort of the practice of DJs. And again, the DJs would isolate the break in a song and then they would repeat it over and over again and then switch sort of like smoothly or abruptly to a different break from a different song. And so the equipment involved in this, and I'm just going to go here really quick, are turntables. Each DJ tended to have 2 turntables so that they could switch back and forth between the records. Headphones so that they could hear what was happening on one record while everyone else was listening to what was happening on the other. Mixers were extremely important because with a mixer, if you had a feed coming in from each of the turntables, that would allow the DJ to switch from one turntable to the other. And again, you'll kind of get a better sense of that when you watch the video Grandmaster Flash. Amplifiers were also really important because they amped the signal of the turntables out to the speaker system so that it could be really loud. And then, of course, microphones. And another thing that I can't really overstate, but I'm not going to talk about too much, is cassette tapes and tape recorders. So this music was often recorded live at parties or in someone's home studio or in actual studios, and then kind of distributed throughout the Bronx by hand. And so people bought tapes that other people made. And so there's kind of the idea of like the boombox or a ghetto blaster. And in some ways that was like a way of advertising for DJs. Someone could go around and play the music of a certain artist, DJ, and then sell those tapes to people just like out in the street. And so there was an element of kind of commerce and entrepreneurship that went along with early hip hop culture as well. And then later what we'll see is that the introduction of vocal processing technologies, digital samplers, and digital drum machines, but that'll come later in the 1980s. So then getting back to kind of this early 1970s where hip hop emerged, some of the earliest techniques included a cut, where you cut from one record to another, scratching, that like looping, so just like looping a break over and over again, and then of course that is all kind of encapsulated into sampling. And again, something that I can't again emphasize enough is that this was music that was meant to be heard live at parties. It was very local. It happened out in a park, out in the street, at these block parties. It was meant to be heard live. So even though people would kind of sell cassettes of the music, it was really meant to be heard live at a party. It was meant to facilitate dancing. It was meant to be a part of that whole scene of a block party. And so some of the earliest DJs, and I should mention, so one of the things that I think is super fascinating about DJs and the technology that they used is that many DJs made or manipulated their own technology, and partly because turntables at that time weren't designed for hip-hop DJs. They were designed to do something else, which is just straightforwardly play back a record. And so a lot of DJs had to modify the turntables that they bought, and also make their own equipment. And some DJs, like DJ Kool Herc, were actually trained as electricians. So they actually had a real technical background. But either way, it took real technical mastery to be able to be a DJ at this time. And something else that it's sort of mythologized at this point, but it did actually happen, which is that for some block parties, they would actually hack into streetlights to use the power from kind of city equipment to power the speakers or to power the DJ equipment. And so, of course, to not get shocked, that took real technical knowledge and technical mastery. And it also took real musical knowledge. So DJs often were really intimately familiar with hundreds of recordings. They collected many records and had really sort of deep musical knowledge. And I think there's kind of some interesting dynamics that go on with sampling culture, and there are whole books written about this, and I'm just going to talk about a few things. But there's really interesting ways in which sampling a record, especially at this time, really subverted kind of ownership of a musical material, of copyright, and also of authorship, but then also still bought into commodity culture. The records were still bought, they were still sold. Again, there was this still kind of economy around hip-hop music at this time. So to get back to the kind of context and the early DJs, again, something that we should all remember is that hip-hop music started with the DJ and MCs, and rapping was added later. So really early hip-hop culture, the DJ stood in center stage. They were the most important element. And in the South Bronx, as I mentioned before, each of the 5 different neighborhoods kind of had like a DJ that was associated with it. It was sort of like each DJ had their own kind of crew and their own sort of territory. They didn't necessarily cross. And so some of the first DJs include DJ Kool Herc, and he's, again, often kind of considered the first hip-hop DJ. And he, again, was really responsible in large part for kind of bringing over this Jamaican dance hall and dub culture to the United States. And the speaker system culture. So he is known for this massive speaker system that he had, which he called his Herculords. So it's a very apt name for a very large speaker system. So his large speaker system was called the Herculords. Another DJ at this time was called Grand Wizard Theodore, and he was only 13 at the time, and he is now known for inventing scratching. Another early DJ from this time is a man named Africa Bambaataa, and he started a little bit later, around 1975, and he's really known for sort of drawing from a real eclectic mix of recordings for his break mixes. You know, German avant-garde music like Kraftwerk, or other things from all over the place. He's well known for drawing from a really wide variety of music. He's also known for founding the Universal Zulu Nation, which is something that's still going on. And he thought of this as sort of like an alternative to gangs, where instead of, you know, violence and drug culture, that he wanted youth to be this United Zulu Nation to be a community and a youth group where basically youth were encouraged to engage in education and creative practices and music and culture. And he was really kind of like a community leader for a really long time through this United Zulu Nation, which became complicated in 2016 when he was accused by several sources of child molestation, of molesting young boys. So again, kind of a really complicated history there, but he's still kind of credited with a lot of with making a lot of innovations in early DJing. And then the last person I want to talk about is Grandmaster Flash, who I really he also started a little bit later in 1975, and I really kind of consider him the great refiner. So he wasn't necessarily the first person to DJ. He wasn't, you know, the originator of the practice, but he, I think, really refined a lot of the practices. He created things like the backspin, and he also created just really sophisticated collages of pre-recorded sound. And so I think, again, I kind of consider him like a great refiner. And one of the things that I want you all to watch that I included after the lecture is Grandmaster Flash has this video in which he kind of demonstrates how he makes a break mix. And this is super informative in terms of how he did his practice, basically. Um, and again, something that I mentioned before, but the DJing could be really lucrative at this time. These DJs made their living often, but through DJing. They would make money by playing at block parties or by selling tapes of their records. And then, of course, later, once rap became more commercial, they could also, make money through performing and touring and things like that. Um, and again, MCs were added later. So DJing and making break mixes happened first, and then DJs were added later. And some some DJs MC'd themselves. So like DJ Kool Herc, he often did the rhymes kind of himself. But then someone like Grandmaster Flash relied on a host of different MCs like Mel Mel, who's pictured here, to do the emceeing for him. And the range of influences is really similar to the just kind of general influences that I already mentioned, with some additional influences, including like jazz scatting from someone like Ella Fitzgerald, but also, same kind of influences of like the Lost Poets, Muhammad Ali, James Brown, things like that. And these are some of early DJs, or early MCs. And again, kind of like DJs, MCs could also sort of make a living performing at parties and doing these things. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that early hip hop was local music that was meant to be heard live, and that all changed in 1979 with Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight, which we're going to talk about in part 3, which is up next. All right, so as I mentioned at the end of part 2, early hip hop was intensely local, all located in the South Bronx in New York City. And that all really changed in 1979 with the release of Rapper's Delight. So a little bit of the background to Rapper's Delight. Oh, and as Trisha Rose likes to say, Rapper's Delight really brought rap from the neighborhood to the radio, to the mainstream. And the radio was often the way that most people would have heard rap in 1979. So a little bit of the background of Rapper's Delight is that it was the brainchild of producer Sylvia Robinson, who's pictured here. And Sylvia Robinson was one of the founders and the producers at Sugar Hill Records. And Sugar Hill Records, prior to 1979, was really a disco label. And then after 79, really became kind of well known as like basically the first rap label. And Sylvia Robinson was just a real badass, if I may say. And she was just an incredibly shrewd businesswoman who had a great ear for what people would want to listen to. And, we can really credit her in a lot of ways with how rap is so popular now. I mean, she first heard rap, I think it was on a local radio station that was beamed out of the South Bronx in 1978. And she was like, wow, there's really something here. I think a lot of people are going to like this. And so she went back to her studio and she decided basically that she was going to form a rap group. So in some ways, the Sugar Hill Gang is not unlike a boy band that like One Direction or NSYNC or something that was formed by a record label. And so Sylvia Robinson formed the Sugar Hill Gang, and she also savvily named the group after the record label. And these were 3 guys that didn't know each other, and they didn't really have any connection to the South Bronx, but they were able to rap, and she made this group using these guys. And so Rapper's Delight is very different and completely removed from the context that early hip-hop was made. It was one of the starkest differences is one, that it wasn't performed live outside at a party. But other than that, it was a studio production that was made using live instruments. So there's no DJ on this track. Sylvia Robinson used live instruments to basically play back Sheik's Good Time. And it's just repeated over and over again. So it's here a live bass, live guitar, live drums, playing that made from Sheik's Good Time. And that's basically the backtrack. And again, it was kind of completely removed from the original context of South Bronx. There's no DJ, these people had no connection to this early context. But it did really bring rap into the mainstream. This was the way that basically anyone outside of the South Bronx would have heard rap at the time. And musically, again, it samples Chic's Good Times. And then also something that's very characteristic of rap at this time is that it uses couplets, which is basically just two lines that rhyme at the end. And there's just like multiple couplets, and sometimes the rhyme will come back at the end of a longer phrase. But it's these kind of combined two-line phrases that, again, is really emblematic of rap at this time. So yeah, that's it for Rapper's Delight, which is one of your required listenings. So make sure you go back and listen to that. So in these early days of rap and hip hop, you could kind of sort of reductively put rap into two categories. The first would be like good time party music, and the second would be like more socially conscious music. And Rapper's Delight, of course, falls into the first category. And then the second category, this piece, The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, really falls into the second of socially conscious rap. And this rap piece, this song, The Message, is often really cited as one of the first kind of well-known rap pieces that was really about kind of social critique and commentary. And the whole song is really just about kind of what it's like to live in the South Bronx. And so this is where we see where the mainstream really kind of catches up. And Grandmaster Flash, of course, was one of the kind of original DJs that was from the South Bronx, and this group was from the South Bronx. So this is where kind of like that actual culture then gets to the mainstream. And yeah, the pieces, it was produced by Sylvia Robinson and Ed Fletcher. It was rapped by Mel Mel and Duke Bodie. And this is Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five here. And in the music video, you'll see all the different, you'll see they're sort of like in the Bronx, and you'll see Mel Mel and the other rappers and kind of get a sense of their style. So like Rapper's Delight, the backing track was made live in the studio. There was no DJ. So Grandmaster Flash does not appear on this record, even though it was a track that was made by his group. So it's kind of interesting that like one of the most well-known tracks that comes out of Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five is a track that Grandmaster Flash was not actually on. So the piece notably uses synthesizers and drum machines. So really from the beginning, from the first time that rap goes to the mainstream, we already see a big shift away from the DJ. And that really continues. So even though groups in the 70s and 80s still had DJs, like we're going to talk about Salt and Peppa, and DJ Spinderella was a really crucial part of that group. But really from the moment that rap hits the mainstream, the DJ became less and less and less the central focus, which sort of makes sense because on the radio, you know, people want to listen to like a catchy song that has a human voice. So for those reasons, I think alone, there is a real move away from the DJ and towards a producer. So anyways, back to the sort of sonic material that you'll hear on The Message. It uses a synth, a Prophet 5, a drum machine, which is a DMX, and live percussion. So again, this was kind of music that was made in the studio. But again, this is sort of an early example of the ways in which rap has kind of always included social commentary and always been rather political, talking about what it's like to live wherever the rapper lives. And again, that sort of hints at how it's very local, talking about issues that are there, and also again kind of with Black cultural and musical and political priorities. So this is another one of your required listening, so please make sure that you go back and listen to that. So that is the end of section 3, and up next we're going to talk about women rappers and DJs. All right, so now we're going to talk about some women MCs mostly, and women rap groups. So as Trisha Rose talks about in her book, women were always a part of rap and hip hop culture. And they were yeah, however, they were often still marginalized kind of in the genre. But early women rap groups and rappers include, and DJs include the Mercedes Ladies, Sha Rock, Lisa Lee, Roxanne Shante. And again, sort of back to Trisha Rose, I mean, they really have a lot of the things that are characteristic of this, or of Black MCs in particular, is a very strong female voice with Black values and Black priorities. It's really crucial to sort of early women MCs up really through the present, and we'll get up to the present. So the first group that I want to talk about is a group that you might not have heard of. They're called The Sequence, and they were formed in 1979, and they formed in response to hearing the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight on the radio. So the Sequence is made up of Cheryl Cook, Gwendolyn Chrisholm, and Angie Brown Stone, who all grew up in South Carolina, and they formed after they heard Rapper's Delight. And they got signed by Sylvia Robinson and Sugar Hill Records after at a Sugar Hill Gang concert, they rushed backstage at the end of the concert and basically forced their way backstage and started rapping for the bass player, and they wanted to see Sylvia Robinson and rap for Sylvia Robinson, and she basically signed them on the spot after hearing the three of them rap. So this is kind of like one of those legendary stories that sometimes you hear about in the music industry. These three just like very industrious young women who really knew they had something going on and kind of, you know, pushed their way to the top to be heard. And so they were signed by Sugar Hill Records in 1979, and their first hit came out really quickly after. Their most well-known hit and their first hit is this track called Funk You Up, which is also one of your required listenings. And one thing that the Sequence did that I think really continued throughout hip-hop and rap's history is that they mixed singing with rapping, but that hadn't necessarily been done in the mainstream before. And this track, Funk You Up, was actually kind of inspired by a cheer from their high school. I don't know if I mentioned this, but they were all basically just fresh out of high school when they formed this group. So they were all, you know, teenagers basically when they first started. They also are sort of credited with coining the term gangster rap. So that's something that ended up becoming important later in the 1990s, which we're not going to talk about in this class, but it's interesting that they were the ones that came up with the term. And something that's kind of sad about the Sequence in retrospect is that Sylvia Robinson and Sugar Hill Records just really took advantage of them. They were really naive. They didn't have a lot of, even though they were, you know, really hardworking and really kind of like pushed to get heard and, you know, went on tour and put out lots of records and did all that stuff. They didn't necessarily have business savvy because they didn't have a lot of business experience. And they got really taken advantage of by the record label, who didn't pay them very much for their tracks, who didn't give them any ownership over their tracks. And they ended up kind of falling out of favor and just like not having any basically of the return on all the work that they did really early on. And they also, you know, were some of the earliest rap hits in general, not just rap hits by a group of women. And so I think, you know, now they're starting to get a little bit more recognition. But I think it's a bit of one of those kind of really sad stories that you sort of hear in the music industry where a group kind of gets taken advantage of by a record label, and they don't really get any compensation, any real compensation long-term for the work that they do to kind of get a genre up off the ground or make a record label really successful. So now we're going to talk about Salt and Peppa, which is a group that you might have all heard of, and it formed in 1985. It's made up by Cheryl James, Sandra Denton, and Deirdre Roper. And some of the themes, after the Sequence, they're really sort of one of probably the most well-known all-female rap group. And they had a lot of hits. They're really successful. They still tour and things like that. And some of the themes in their music are about agency over their own representation, their bodies and their pleasure, expressive freedom. So, you know, rapping however they want to rap. They have like a real hard-hitting style that was super influential to rappers that came after, and also financial and creative independence. So this is a theme that goes throughout all of their music, and again was also, these themes in general are pretty influential to other people. There's also a bit of an sort of activist theme that goes throughout some of their work. For example, their sort of famous track, Let's Talk About Sex, was made in the 1980s in response to the AIDS crisis. And it was all about basically having conversations about consent and making sure that people were using protection and talking about having sex and things like that to just kind of create a healthier culture around sex. So I think that's an example of that. But they're probably most well known for a lot of their tracks that are really about sex and that really kind of flip the script. So they're sometimes kind of raunchy or explicit and talk about men and men's bodies and sex in ways that were typically kind of heard in men's rap songs. And again, this is kind of a way that they sort of took agency over their bodies, over their sexuality, over their pleasure, and things like that. And that's important for a lot of reasons that Trisha Rose talks about in her book. And I don't have the quote there, but here it is. So this really gets back to kind of the historical representations of Black women that Trisha Rose talks about in her chapter that you are going to read for, or have read for, assignment number 2. And I want to just kind of reinforce some of these things, not to kind of reinforce the stereotype, but just so that we kind of understand what's going on and why it was such a big deal that Salt and Peppa really took ownership and agency over, or not that other people didn't take ownership or agency, but how that was so important in their music in terms of moving things forward for Black women in particular. So the historical representation of Black women, especially kind of in mass culture and mass media, is really connected to the enslavement of Black people and the oppression and objectification of Black people. And it really goes back all the way to the justifications that were used for things like colonialism in the first place. So moving into someone else's land, but then also used as justification for the enslavement of Black people and Black women in particular. And it also is sort of related to things like scientific racism, in which sort of pseudoscience was created around people by, say, like measuring their head size or their waist size or their butt size, things like that, in order to kind of create false justification for the oppression or the taking advantage of other people. And with Black women in particular, they were incredibly disadvantaged because of these systems. And Trisha Rose talks about Sarja Bartman and just kind of the systems of colonial visuality. So just like the ways in which people look and how that's used to sort of make judgments or certain forms of control over them. So historically, one of the justifications that was used so that basically white imperialists could used for the enslavement of Black people and Black women in particular was that the sizes of their body parts, including their butts or their bust and their lips, things like that, were used to make claims about their intelligence or about sort of their saying that they were like sexually depraved or that they were immoral or things like that, which are of course 100% false. And so in some ways, after the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, there's more awareness of women's body and taking ownerships of women's body. And so then with Salt and Peppa, what we see is that the butt is, when Salt and Pepper talk about the butt or when they talk their own butts or sexuality in these ways, it's really a way of shedding a lot of the sort of cultural baggage that has been placed on Black women around their bodies, around their sexuality, and just basically kind of like shirking that shame and again taking new ownership and agency over how Black women are talked about and depicted in the media. And Rose says in song lyrics, the butt is talked about in ways that attempt to challenge racist assumptions that suggest it as a sign of inferiority, even though it continues to remain a sexualized sign. So again, kind of like shirking those sort of colonial associations again with inferiority. And so Trisha Rose, of course, talks about that a lot more eloquently than I do. And so if you do have any more questions about that, I suggest you go back and read that section of Rose's article. And so I think that in some ways this is also just like a really important way in which Salt and Peppa in particular sort of distinguish themselves from a white male norm and also didn't conform to the ways in which kind of mass culture told them they needed to be, and could sort of take agency over themselves, and also again kind of independence, things like that. So our main listening for Salt and Peppa is a song called Shoop, And you'll hear the opening. It's sort of they have these kind of cat calls where they're talking about men who are working out on the beach. And again, this is a kind of flip the script moment. And again, it's really about them taking agency over their sexual pleasure and over their independence. You know, another theme that they talk about a lot, as I mentioned before, is like financial independence. So it's sort of like they don't need a man to take care of them financially. They want a man because they want it and want a man, and it doesn't have to do with any kind of transactional thing. It's like they're more equal in an equal partnership, basically. And so again, this is very feminist and especially for Black women. So they sample Ike Turner's I'm Blue. There's also references to Cole Porter's You Do Something to Me and Prince's song Sexy Motherfucker. And I think that like one of the reasons why I wanted to mention all of those tracks is that you also see something that's really emblematic of hip hop is just like this interpolation of lots of different cultural material and cultural references in a really sophisticated way. And so also musically, this song is really smooth. It's kind of mid-tempo. It really kind of creates a vibe that's like, yeah, it's a real sexy vibe. And when asked what shoop means, that's kind of what Salt and Peppa said. They said, it's whatever, it's a whole vibe. So shoop is our required listening for this section. I also included Push It, just because that's another track by Salt and Peppa that we might be a little bit more familiar with that has kind of similar themes. So now I want to talk about Queen Latifah and her track Ladies First. And this is kind of a different approach to kind of critiquing societal issues and societal narratives around women and Black women in particular. And so this track featured a British rapper named Monty Love, and Queen Latifah is really sort of known as being a conscious rapper. So as I mentioned before, The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five really kind of kicks off this trend in rap and hip hop that continues to this day with rappers like Mos Def and Common, people like that, where a lot of their raps are really about kind of biting social critique. And Queen Latifah is definitely a part of that tradition. And a lot of themes that go in that tradition are things like Black nationalism and anti-colonialism, and often connected to things like the Nation of Islam. And in particular, as Trisha Rose talks about also in her article, with the track Ladies First, Queen Latifah really wanted to highlight the kind of legacy of Black female activism, and that's super evident in the music video, which I also included here, and it will be included on Canvas after the lecture. But Queen Latifah says about the track, I wanted to show the strength of Black women in history. Strong Black women, those were good examples. I wanted to show what we've done. We've done a lot. It's just that people don't know it. Sisters have been in the midst of things for a long time, but we just don't get to see it that much. So again, it's sort of like trying to highlight these narratives and Black female activists who have been a part of social movements like the voting rights and feminist movements, and also just in general Black liberation movements, you know, really in the United States for a very long time. So please go back and listen to Ladies First. It is your required listening, one of your required listenings for this lecture. And so now I want to kind of jump to the present, where sort of these two streams of kind of multiple streams of themes in rap by women kind of collide, which is in Megan Thee Stallion's SNL performance of Savage, and also WAP, of course. So most of you have probably heard WAP at this point. It was this past summer's kind of big hit. And so you can imagine how Megan Thee Stallion is really kind of the carer of the legacies that we've kind of seen in from female rappers, which is a lot of Megan Thee Stallion's rap are very body positive. They're very sex positive. It's all about agency over her body. But then there's also a real strain of kind of social consciousness and political activism in her work as well. And I really see her coming out of the legacy of people like Lil' Kim, who we didn't talk about, but Lil' Kim is especially known for these really kind of raunchy, sexually explicit tracks. One of my favorites is called Not Tonight. So if you haven't heard it already, you should go back and listen to that. And you can really see Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion. Oh, I realize I spelled her name wrong. I'll make sure to fix that in the slides. Really kind of take on that legacy with WAP. And of course, Salt and Peppa, Queen Latifah, and Missy Elliott. And again, especially when it comes to like sexually explicit lyrics, that's again a really good chance to kind of flip the script, and then also kind of counter narratives of Black women's inferiority that we've seen kind of traditionally in kind of colonialist and like mainstream narratives about Black women. And now I really want to talk about her performance of Savage on SNL, which happened a few weeks ago. So one thing that I think is really interesting is that this performance, again, really like kind of combines a lot of the streams and the themes that we talked about in hip hop in general, but especially with women's rap. And if you haven't seen it already, I've linked to it at the end of the lecture. And this performance is really in response to the fallout from the lack of charges in Breonna Taylor's murder back in March. And so for those of you that don't know, the Kentucky Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, was sort of in charge of bringing charges against the 3 officers that killed Breonna Taylor. And he chose not to bring murder charges against them. And so they weren't charged for murder. And there's a lot of issues about that, including the jury kind of like making statements about it and not being okay with it. And there's just been a huge uproar about it ever since. And with Megan Thee Stallion's performance of Savage, she has this whole message about protecting Black women, both at the beginning and in the middle. And in the middle, she includes samples of Malcolm X and also Tamika Mallory, who is a current activist. And it's all about kind of protecting Black women and also, again, kind of highlighting the activist work that's happening currently, but also historically by Black activists. And I think it's really interesting that this kind of activist, socially conscious message is combined with the track Savage, which on the face of it is kind of a superficial track, but it's about, in some ways it's not. It's about kind of all of the multifaceted things that a woman or a Black woman could be. It's very proclaiming. It's, I am this, I am that, I'm savage, I am bougie, I'm ratchet, like things that might be contradictory, but she's like, no, I'm all these things and they all exist in me. And really just, again, kind of taking ownership over one's identity and wearing that really proudly as a woman or a Black woman in particular. So please go back and listen and watch this SNL performance of Savage. And that is it for lectures 15 and 16. If you have any questions or want to chime in with comments, please do so on this week's discussion board. All right, take care.
Hey everyone, after my last tutorial on how to make a bucket list, at least 3, but 1 will do. A flint is tricky. You have to break this magma block, pick up a lava, and place a block before the lava flows. If you're not familiar with it, it can be a bit tricky, but just practice